Today in world literature, we turn to the fiction of Yukio Mishima of Japan. Our lecturer, Dr. Bert Kimmelman, pays special attention to the story Patriotism and what it reveals about beliefs of its author. Considered a provocative and controversial writer, Mishima remains, despite his sensational biography, an important literary figure whose works are likely to endure in the canon of world literature. Born in 1925, Mishima took a law degree from Tokyo University and in 1947 devoted himself to full-time fiction. His work was consistently treated with highest regard, and he was nominated for the 1965 Nobel Prize in Literature. In affirmation of his convictions that self-sacrifice is necessary to achieve spiritual fulfillment, he committed seppuku in 1970, thus ending a brilliant career. Based on the dual suicide of a married couple in 1936, in which a band of insurrectionists organized a rebellion against Japan's military forces on behalf of the emperor, the story was described by Mishima as neither a comedy nor a tragedy, but a tale of bliss. In this lecture, Dr. Kimmelman explains how, for Mishima, this is so.
Yukio Mishima's short story entitled Patriotism has found its way into many anthologies of literature, particularly in those appearing in the United States. This story deserves the attention it has received because of its purely literary attributes, of course, but also because its writing reveals much about the entire body of work of its author. Yet the story has perhaps been reprinted so very often because its theme perpetuates a Western stereotype of Japan specifically, and Asia generally. On the other hand, the story could only have been written by an Easterner, and in fact its subject matter, the ritual suicide of a young married couple in pre-World War II Japan, is especially germane to Mishima's personal life. The story marks a transition in Japanese culture from an older world of military honor. The traditional samurai code of Bushido is not mentioned specifically in the story, but the actions of the two characters exemplify the samurai, or rather older aristocratic Japanese way of life, in which suicide is viewed as honorable. The story seems to want to pay homage to what Mishima might have said was the passing of this older way of seeing the world, as Japan continued on its course of westernization begun in the Meiji era of the late 19th century. Indeed, the story concentrates in often shocking detail on the step-by-step process of the husband's and subsequently the wife's seppuku, ritual self-immolation. First the husband's harakiri, in other words, the 3 prescribed traditional cuts he inflicts upon himself with his sword, and later his wife's slashing of her throat with her dagger, also as prescribed for a samurai woman. These acts reside at the center of this story, and in a fashion they are what the story is essentially about. They are also crucial to understanding the samurai worldview. The immensely powerful description of these acts is meant to valorize, to heroicize the couple, and thereby to salute a bygone era. The story does not openly assert Mishima's wishes, as the public record has shown, for a return to the older Japanese ways, because it doesn't have to. In fact, Mishima's greatest gifts as a writer were his uncanny ability to locate a scene with startling, subtle, and at times extremely poignant exactitude, and to enlist his scenes in the service of deeply psychological explorations of character. In Patriotism, the inner depths of the two characters are suggested, but are not fully elaborated. This omission on the part of Mishima is, I think, intentional, insofar as he would have wanted the two people to exist for his readers as icons standing for the richness and rightness of the samurai code. Nevertheless, his meticulous descriptions of their deaths do not occur only from the point of view of an outsider looking on. The scene of the story is inflected with great sensuality, which becomes a vehicle for elevating the deaths and joining death with love as a virtue. Also, the detailing of the physical state of the couple's bedroom and the bodies in their transitions from life to death is complemented and made extraordinarily vivid through an accounting of this destruction by the perpetrator victims themselves. Here, for example, is a passage that first describes the mindset of the young Lieutenant Takayama, having initially stabbed himself on one side of his abdomen with his sword, and then his summoning of sufficient courage and concentration to pull the sword across to the other side, after which a second similar cut is made vertically, followed by a cut into the windpipe. Despite the effort he had himself put into the blow, the lieutenant had the impression that someone else had struck the side of his stomach agonizingly with a thick rod of iron. For a second or so his head reeled, and he had no idea what had happened. The 5 or 6 inches of naked point had vanished completely into his flesh, and the white bandage he has wrapped about his hand to keep it from being cut so he can manipulate his weapon, the white bandage gripped in his clenched fist pressed directly against his stomach. He returned to consciousness. The blade had certainly pierced the wall of the stomach, he thought. His breathing was difficult. His chest thumped violently, and in some far deep region which he could hardly believe was a part of himself, a fearful and excruciating pain came welling up as if the ground had split open to disgorge a boiling stream of molten rock. The pain came suddenly nearer with terrifying speed. The lieutenant bit his lower lip and stifled an instinctive moan. Was this seppuku, he was thinking? It was a sensation of utter chaos, as if the sky had fallen on his head and the world was reeling drunkenly. His willpower and courage, which had seemed so robust before he made the incision, had now dwindled to something like a single hair-like thread of steel, and he was assailed by the uneasy feeling that he must advance along this thread, clinging to it with desperation. His clenched fist had grown moist. Looking down, he saw that both his hand and the cloth about the blade were drenched in blood. His loincloth, too, was dyed a deep red. It struck him as incredible that, amidst this terrible agony, things which could be seen could still be seen, and existing things existed still. As this passage may suggest, Mishima places the action of the story in his foreground in order to make the story itself into an emblem of proper samurai conduct. Yet the wider and deeper implications of the action are spelled out as well, although not didactically or explicitly, but simply through the description. His masterful use of metaphor discloses the intimate relationship between individual human conduct and universal forces. Hence, for instance, the pain the lieutenant experiences in disemboweling himself is depicted figuratively as the ground splitting open to disgorge a boiling stream of molten rock. Here, Mishima creates a parallel between cataclysmic natural events and individual destiny, in which both seem logical and natural outcomes in life. The quote-unquote welling up of the molten rock is like the man's pain, but also like the subsequent quote-unquote bulging out of his intestines from within the now opened body cavity. Suicide, thereby, is part of a natural order of things, and indeed Mishima wishes to view, in Buddhist fashion, human events within the larger and engulfing cosmic time. Justifying human conduct, moreover, also in turn justifies a certain political position specific to modern Japanese life. There is a great unity being sketched in this story, comprised of action, pain, pleasure, love and sex, death, and on the grander level, order and chaos, and on the still larger level itself, and on a still larger level, existence itself, as opposed to the Buddhist void or non-existence. Yet if a certain political action is being sponsored in the story, it is not being supported through preaching or other forms of pedantry, but rather is merely being subtly proposed by way of example. And in fact, this story served as an example for none other than Mishima himself. He came of age between the world wars and died by an act of seppuku in 1970, which he planned carefully long ahead of time. This short story, one might say, was a part of his plan. Mishima's first works were published in the mid-1940s, and he was prolific until the end of his life. He was not only a writer of short stories, but of novels, films, and plays, and he was an actor. Lieutenant Takayama is forced to crush a band of rebels in this story, Patriotism, by Imperial command. He is the friend of these young officers who are involved in what was an actual incident. On February 26, 1936, a group of military extremists conspired to assassinate government leaders in order to change the direction of national governmental policies. In fact, this rebellion, driven by Japan's ultra-right wing, did precipitate a change of government and eventually caused Japan's expansion of its international aggression to include Western powers in World War II. Agonized by the dilemma he faces, Takayama decides to die rather than arrest his fellow junior officers who are part of this rebellion. The lieutenant will slash himself to death after indulging in an orgy of pleasure with his wife, Reiko. Their love-making revolves around their death pact that includes not only her witnessing of her husband's destruction, self-destruction, but also, subsequently, her death by her own hand. Notably, for them both, no one will assist them, as is the usual custom, by cutting off their heads. They must each suffer the full agony of their fatal wounds, eventually losing sufficient blood to cause a lapse into unconsciousness. Their final shared living acts, tidying up their home, writing death poems, wrapping keepsakes for their friends, observing the ritual gestures before the kamidana, the god shelf or home altar dedicated to the Shinto gods, drinking sake, bathing and making love, and finally committing harakiri. These acts collectively express their and Mishima's desire for purification through eroticism and oblivion, the ultimate canceling out of their existences. In many of Mishima's works, we find an obsession with death and an apocalyptic vision of the end of the world. Also, we find an abiding concern for political conservatism and a rejection of the New Japan that began to take shape with the onset of the Meiji era. These two strands are brought together in Patriotism, which was published in the same year as another of Mishima's stories about the coup d'etat. That same year, Mishima also published a story called Kiku on the 10th, and 5 years later, he published the novel The Voices of the Dead. The themes in these works are very, very similar. There had also been a suicide in his 1950 book, Blue Period. In addition, the novel Runaway Horses, the second book of his landmark tetralogy, The Sea of Fertility, portrays a fictional rendering of the rebellion and culminates with the suicide by stabbing of the book's protagonist. That book was written shortly before Mishima took his own life in spectacular fashion in 1970, having seized the Japanese Army radio station with his followers, members of a paramilitary conservative group called the Shield Society. and broadcasting his seppuku to the nation over the radio. Mishima's suicide was, like the young lieutenant's, arguably, both a personal and a political act. Mishima also discusses seppuku at great length in his didactic book, Sun and Steel. Gwen Boardman Peterson points out that Mishima's last public words, at the end of his speech urging a return to Japan's manly ideal of art and action, were a salute to the Japanese emperor, and they recall the last words of the lieutenant in patriotism, crying out, "Long live the imperial forces," as he committed seppuku. Yet for Mishima, more so than his protagonist, his suicide by harakiri had to do with the aesthetics of what he called a beautiful death. Even taking this distinction into account, however, it is notable that Mishima made a film of patriotism in which he played the role of the lieutenant. He also acted out a ritual harakiri in another film called Assassin, made the year before his actual death. Peterson writes that in the film, Mishima emphasized the juxtaposition of beauty and ugliness suggested in the story Patriotism, and rendered the young couple's love in lyrical terms, using the traditional no stage for his setting and using the traditional Japanese no drama, no stage for the film's setting, and concluding with an image of a raked sand Zen garden. But intervening scenes were filled with horrifying, specific close-ups of blood and bowels and the agony of the, as it were, noble ritual suicide. Mishima's attitude toward both the erotic and the ugly aspects of his strangely rendered beautiful cruelty in his fiction as well as in this film is one aspect of his own genius. His death was his ultimate statement of his theory of tragedy, which was the only possible expression of a view of the beauty of life and art that is found in every aspect of his work. Mishima believed that the profoundest depths of his imagination lay in death, and he spoke of burnishing the imagination for death in an image significantly linked with his obsessively symbolic sword. Death by the sword was a beautiful death, the act of seppuku the ultimate beauty. It is important to keep in mind, finally, that Mishima regarded himself as performing a noble action designed to stimulate a return to Japan's heroic virtues. To read Mishima's death as an example of fanatical nationalism, for instance, is to distort an ethical and aesthetic statement into a political gesture. Of all his works, moreover, the story Patriotism is where Mishima has decided to force his reader step by step through the seppuku ritual to the reality of pain, through blood that forms pools, stains the tatami mats, splashes upon a white kimono, drenches the wife's clothing so that she, quote, feels damp in the region of her thighs, end quote. Here, too, we see fat clinging to the sword blade, entrails bursting forth as through a wound vomited, and a meticulously minute recording of vomit, retch, and stench. There is a critical question of intention here, especially in light of Mishima's extensive commentary on patriotism and of his widely quoted assertion that it is a story of happiness. The lieutenant's refusal to carry out the orders of his superiors is as much a betrayal as the assassination attempts of his friends, a betrayal of his military ideals and loyalty to the emperor. After all, his orders to capture his friends come indirectly from the emperor. This set of contradictions forms the background for the story. In the foreground, exemplified by the meticulous action, is the perfection of the heroic ideal, which is given visual intensity and a domesticity by a wedding portrait in which the bride holds her fan with a hand delicate as the bud of a moonflower. Reiko pledges her wifely duty on the wedding night by placing her own dagger on the tatami mat opposite her husband's sword to show that she is ready, if necessary, to join him in death. Here then we see the origins not only of the beautiful depths of their persons, but of the logical outcome, the complete flowering, ironically, of their marriage, which gives issue not to children, but to blood that has been mingled with the fluids of procreation. In this sense, the story is nihilistic, yet it is also true to its own precepts. That is, sacrifice and honor may preclude a certain kind of happiness, one fulfillment taking the place of another. In either case, as Mishima writes, the lives of the couple are, quote, lived beneath the solemn protection of the gods, end quote, and there is a harmony to them. As Peterson writes, the tragic shadow in their lives deepens as Mishima comes to dwell on the familiar details of the couple's routine and on the subtle deviations from the familiar, as when the lieutenant helps to put away the bedding, not one of the traditional husbandly duties. Inexorably, this, as it were, heroic couple, Mishima specifically calls them heroic, this heroic couple marches on to the moment when the gods must weep. Throughout the preliminary rituals leading up to their suicides, the irony is restrained. The relative peace emanating from their actions, however, is disrupted as the husband for the first time shows his public or soldier's self to his wife. Mishima spares no detail of the sensational, from the moment when the sword is first, quote-unquote, entangled with the lieutenant's entrails, to the time when its blade emerges tipped with fat, and even beyond when Reiko, her socks slippery with blood, walks downstairs to unfasten the bolt on the front door so that their bodies may be rescued from putrefaction. Our final vision is of Reiko's suicide as she considers that she will now taste for herself, quote, the true bitterness and sweetness of that great moral principle in which her husband believed, end quote. Mishima's intention in writing this story is as deep and ambiguous as the narrative itself. Yet the ambiguity here, rather than weakening the narrative force of the story, strengthens it greatly. For this tale hovers over life and death and discloses, through implication, the understanding that life is conditioned by death, and that life's worth is measured by one's actions, by quality. Like the ironic title of his great masterpiece, The Sea of Fertility, patriotism reveals the difficulties of being loyal and true, and of life as the seeking out of death.
Dr. Kimmelman's lecture is, in essence, an excellent example of biographical criticism. That is, his lecture tells us about the life of Mishima. In addition, Dr. Kimmelman also demonstrates the interplay between Japanese cultural values and Mishima's own. And finally, Dr. Kimmelman returns to the text of patriotism with a deeper understanding of the creation and artistry of the text itself.